The Memorial Cup has come and gone. We're now in the thick of the NHL Stanley Cup final between the Panthers and the Oilers. But just around the corner is the NHL Draft, which will be held at the Sphere down in Las Vegas on June 28th. So I thought, why not ask an expert? We've got Sam Cosentino joining us from Rogers Sportsnet. Sam, you cover junior hockey pretty in depth. You follow along with what's going on leading up to the NHL Draft. We got the draft in Vegas coming up on the 28th. How are you doing with the mock draft? I saw you released one earlier this week because this draft's been fascinating.
Yeah, I don't know. Like I'm not big on keep doing them over and over again, but that was a suggestion that we at least do two of them. I mean, we always do one for the lottery show, because then we have a determination of what those 16 teams are going to look like. And then I usually do one, a couple of days before the draft, just helps to draw up some interest and that sort of thing. But management came back and said they wanted one here after the combine, and I felt like some of the information gleaned from there would be helpful in creating the 1.0 version. So that one's done and out of the way, and work on 2.0 has already begun.
Well, everyone for the entire year has been saying, Macklin Celebrini, he'll be going number one. But after that, it seems like it's anybody's guess who could go number two. You had from the OHL, Beckett Seneca potentially going at number 5. What is it with Seneca's game that really stood out to you?
Well, the first thing that jumps out is the fact that you look at that championship series and when Beckett wasn't a part of it, that one guy could have that sort of impact says a lot about what Seneca means to their group. And then looking individually, go back to his 16-year-old year, I really like the work ethic he brought to the table. He played with some detail in his game. And then this year, I thought the offensive side of his game really started to come out. And of course, there's growth there. He's got parents who are athletic. So you think that when you look at his body, that he's going to be able to play with, probably an additional 20 pounds and probably still has some height growth to still occur here in his future. So put all those things together. I know people thought that was a bit of a reach at 5. I had a specific target as Montreal taking a forward because they need big forwards. And I don't know if Gillen necessarily fits that bill. Lindstrom would, but I think he's gone by then. So that kind of leaves Seneca. And to be honest with you, I think there's been a groundswell of support for Seneca ever since the playoffs, watching him when he was with Oshawa and played, and when he was hurt and how they played without him. So even if he doesn't go at 5, as I projected in 1.0, I still do think that he's a guy that might end up here in the top 10.
Well, we got to see Seneca up close in the first round of the playoffs between Barrie and Oshawa, and it was just amazing just to see how he can turn a game around. And it's with your write-up there and what you just said, it basically sums it up. Just the creativity with Seneca, and then you match him on an Oshawa Generals team that kind of exceeded expectations this year, and going into next year, Seneca will take that next step, or at least you would expect that.
You'd think so. Him and Cal Ritchie should be, a pretty dynamic couple of forces, or a dynamic duo, if you will, for Oshawa here moving forward. So, I think when you take Beckett Seneca and you do the whole thing, I think there's a lot to like there. So it'll be interesting to see how this kind of plays itself out in terms of the top, 10 or 12 picks of this draft, because I do believe there's going to be a ton of variance, and who knows what happens there with Seneca.
And we had a bit of a treat at the Memorial Cup with London and Saginaw going at it in the final. And they've got a pair of defensemen who've been kind of going back and forth in the rankings all year long. Sam Dickinson with the Knights and Zane Parekh with the Saginaw Spirit. Two opposite defensemen, one offensive-minded, one a little more stay-at-home. What are some of the differences that you're finding as well with their games?
Well, I mean, for me, Parekh is probably the best defensive defenseman I have ever seen in the CHL, and that runs back to the late '90s. When I was actually doing some games in Barrie and Mississauga and Brampton at the time, and even Toronto St. Mike's. So that I've seen a lot of guys come through, and not just in the Ontario Hockey League, but that extends out to what we saw with the Quebec Major Junior Hockey League and the Western Hockey League. So I think when it comes to Parekh, that elite ability, and every scout I talk to says, there's nobody who has that. Having said that, that pick does come with some risk. So I had Perek for the last 3 or 4 months. I'd had him ahead in my rankings, which is different than a mock draft, ahead of Dickinson. But I try in a mock draft to put myself in a general manager situation. And talking to some colleagues and some other people, I thought, well, what if I was the guy who had the mic and had to go and make that pick right then and there? Do I want the Sam Dickinson who his upside is a massive ceiling, or his downside is a second pairing defenseman, which is pretty good, who's got great size and skating ability? Or would I try and hit the grand slam with Perek and try and find the next Erik Karlsson? And I thought to myself, if I was the general manager and I had to make that pick, I got to tell you, I might lean Dickinson just because it's a safer pick. Me personally, in terms of just ranking alone, I do like Perek ahead of Dickinson, but it'll be kind of neat to watch those two go and see which one ends up going first.
Well, it's such a great rivalry that we had all year with Saginaw, London. So it's going to be fascinating at the draft because, yeah, like you said, two different defensemen. And we're even seeing at the Stanley Cup final how these stay-at-home defensemen, they could be all the difference like Dickinson. But if you get that offensive creativity like Karlsson, that could be a huge difference too for a National Hockey League club.
Oh yeah, for sure. And like the game just goes in ebbs and flows, right? So you think about when Daryl Sutter's teams won in 12 and 14 with the LA Kings. Oh, they're big, they're heavy, they're going to grind you down. We went away from that a little bit. We went to smaller, skilled, deeper teams. And now we're seeing a progression back to the size game, where especially when you look at defensive cores and how they last and how they're able to withstand the rigors of playoffs right on through the whole thing, size has become a thing again. So, having said that, does that change the narrative for Dickinson or some of the others that are bigger guys than Perek in the first round and seeing where they end up going? But it is fun to watch how what we see in the NHL, when the season comes to a close, it's a short time thereafter, we start to see teams wanting to build in the mode of the team that had just won. So I think we're kind of slowly going back to that size thing, and the other commentary that I talk to a lot of scouts about is you need one team to get you in and one team in the playoffs. And I think having that 6 foot or sub 6 foot defenseman who's a puck mover, can run a power play, is super, super important. He's the guy who's probably going to get you in, but is he going to last the distance in the playoffs? So that's the dilemma, and I think the inner kind of dialogue that teams are having amongst themselves.
And a player that a lot of Barrie Colt fans are curious about, Cole Beaudoin. He had a bit of a slow start in his rookie season, but this past year, we saw him take a huge leap forward in his offensive capabilities. Do you think he could crack into that first round at the NHL draft?
Right now I'm looking at Cole and I'm thinking he's probably a guy who enters the conversation at pick 26 and probably fits in a range up to pick 40. So, like the one thing that everybody is going to be certain about with this guy is that he is a physical specimen. And all the testing that was done up in Barrie and what we saw at the combine recently completed in Buffalo, he's the guy. Like, there is no doubt about it. He's jacked, he's ripped, he's in wonderful physical shape. And I think to a larger degree, that speaks about the commitment of a player. So if he's willing to go and do all that work off the ice, I'm pretty certain that when you're asked to do something on the ice, that he's going to work to that end to improve in that area. And so we saw some of that with Cole this year. Like, the one thing my colleague Jason Buchla and I have been talking about a little bit when it comes to Cole is, I was always concerned a little bit about the agility in the skating, not his top line speed. I think that's fine, but just the agility and being able to twist and turn and get out of corners and aid in what is already a pretty good puck protect mode. And Book seems to think that, that part of his game is not going to be a problem at all. I tend to differ a little bit, but if NHL teams are feeling like Books is feeling, then that's a guy who probably enters the first round as opposed to where I think he probably goes in the early second.
And you mentioned the combine, another player from the OHL who had a great showing there, Jet Luchenko of the Guelph Storm. Was it the combine that kind of gave him a boost in your 1.0 mock draft?
Well, tracking Jet going back to about Christmas, he started to make a serious rise in my rankings, and it was right around that time I ran into general manager George Burnett at at a U16 game here, not too far from where I live, and George and I got to talking a little bit, and just had so many good things to say about Jet. And I had reached out and spoke to a couple of other people in the organization, aside from the hockey part, like what's he like as a kid, and how are his practice habits and that sort of thing. And all of those things came back super positive. So when it comes to Jet, now I'm looking at the guy, okay, he's had a steady rise. You look at the under 18s, he's playing important minutes, important face-offs. He's doing all the things asked of him. And there's no real concern or worry about points, goal scoring, that sort of stuff. So now we're looking at an individual is going to work. An individual is a good individual, a guy who can play in important situations. And so now you look at his points. Oh, he's about a point per game, so that's good. So he's starting to check a lot of boxes. You show up at the combine, you sit down with the young man, you interview him, and you're like, okay, I get it. Soft spoken, super confident, knows what he is, knows what he has to be, knows what he has to do. And then I look at a guy that, again, when it comes to some of the testing and you see some of the results, you're like, oh, okay. I knew he was put together, but I had no idea he was a guy who was going to be seen in the top 10 or 12 of a lot of the testing elements at the combine. So now you're starting to kind of complete that picture. And I think that's why I have him where I have him. And, if he gets into that 15 or earlier range, wouldn't surprise me either.
And it is quite the interesting blend of OHLers who are up for grabs at the draft coming up at the end of the month in Vegas. And, another player that stood out to me this season was Liam Greentree, playing on a Windsor Spitfires team that had their struggles this season. But despite that, Greentree's still a player that kind of stood out there on the ice.
Yeah, he is an interesting guy. I mean, he's got great work ethic. He's not afraid to go to any parts of the ice. He uses his physicality, but he doesn't abuse it. And he can really shoot the puck. So when you combine all those things together, what does it look like? It probably looks like a power forward at the National Hockey League level. And again, watching the playoffs and seeing the durability of some of these bigger guys, I think he's going to be helped by a bit of a recency bias there. But really good year for him. You go back to last year, really good year as a 16-year-old on a Windsor team that was deep. This year, everybody kind of leaves. He's left to his own devices. A couple other guys there, of course, Cole Davis, Christopher, or whatever. But he was, now thrown out to the Wolves as the guy who was going to face the top matchup every night, and as a guy who Windsor had to lean on to score. And he answered both of those questions all season long.
And for you, you've been watching a lot of these young players. Anyone else from the OHL that has caught your attention leading up to this draft?
Well, Merrick Van Acker is a guy that actually just got off a phone call about an hour ago, talking to somebody about Van Acker, and so super, super impressive guy. It's kind of neat how the cards have fallen into place for him, because he's not a guy who succumbed to the pressure of moving to the Greater Toronto area to go play his minor hockey there. He stayed in Brantford, was true to his home, got drafted out of Brantford. That was by Hamilton at the time, and go figure, the team ends up moving to Brantford. So it's kind of neat how things have fallen into place for him. But I think the one thing that really struck me with meeting him on the weekend was the fact that he's been dealing with shoulder stuff since November, but you'd never know it. He just seemingly has been on this steady rise since that time. And I think he had ended up with 36 goals. And so I asked him at the combine, I said, hey, without that shoulder thing, like, what are you thinking here? Would you have scored 50? And he said, no, like straight out. Like most kids, you'd say, oh, yeah, I would add 50 for sure. He's like, no, I suppose I probably would add a few more. I don't think I would have got to 50. It's bothered me, but not to the point where it's debilitating. So like that honesty and stuff, I thought was really, really kind of refreshing. So he's probably a guy that, I think ends up getting here into the latter stages of the first round. We know Steve Staios drafted him in Hamilton before they moved to Brantford, and he's the GM in Ottawa now. So there would definitely be some familiarity there.
Well, Sam, I appreciate you doing this, chatting about the prospects, and I'm looking forward to your mock draft 2.0. See how many more changes there are between now and then.
Yeah, I think we're going to see a few. Thanks for having me on.
So that was Sam Cosentino from Rogers Sportsnet. Always great to talk hockey, and it's going to be exciting to see where these OHLers will land at the National Hockey League level. Does Beckett Seneca become the first OHLer selected in 2024? Or does Zane Parekh or Sam Dickinson move ahead? It's going to be fascinating. Always an exciting time of year as these players, they've been working hard throughout their junior careers and growing up, always dreaming about playing in the National Hockey League. So they're that much closer to fulfilling their goals. So that's how I see it from the booth. And don't forget to hit like and subscribe as well. Try and do a few more of these interviews before the start of the 2024-25 regular season. And also we'll continue the series looking at the OHL team histories, as we've now done 3 of the 20 so far. So stay tuned for that. Again, thank you very much for all your support. Talk to you again soon.